Andrew Marr is one of Britain's most respected political journalists, and soon after Labour's election last year, he had a spring in his step.
A couple of sources of optimism, because I completely agree with the questionnaire. We have to be optimistic looking forward. I think just having a stable government that will be there for 5, maybe 10 years, who knows, but with sort of ordinary, down-to-earth, serious people talking like the rest of us in charge of the government, and a plan that doesn't shift very much for investment, is going to mean a wall of money coming into this country from around the world. You look at the chaos going on the continent, particularly in France. You look at the chaos likely ahead in the United States. And suddenly, for once, for the first time in many of our lives, actually Britain looks like a little haven of peace and stability. And that in itself is going to draw money into this country.
Well, it's been a year of the grown-ups in charge. Britain hasn't really been an image of peace and stability. We've had riots on the street. The wall of money is yet to make itself known. Keir Starmer, of course, is the least popular Prime Minister of all time. And now Andrew Marr has had a change of tune. So in the New Statesman this week, he writes, "I thought Labour would fix everything. I was wrong." This is from his article. The Labour establishment had underestimated the deeper difficulties of so much it was facing. The intractable problem of ballooning welfare spending and worklessness, the sheer incompetence of much of the state, the pressure on housing and public services caused by the post-Brexit immigration wave. It did not feel as if a new government meant a new start, not in daily life. Nothing works continued to echo everywhere, from train travellers, swimmers on dirty beaches, millennials struggling to get into decent housing, motorists stuck in urban gridlock, and outraged shopkeepers whose stock had been looted by gangs with no fear of the police. Very quickly, managerialism seemed as disappointing as ever. Helena, that clip of Andrew Marr sort of haunted him online, especially from people on the right. So I don't necessarily want to pile on. Everyone gets things wrong. What can we learn from this, though? Was he sort of the last person who seemed remotely positive about the Labour Party? I suppose there are still 15% of the public who think they're doing not the worst job ever, but what are you taking from this change of heart from Andrew Marr?
I mean, again, I think it's just the fact that at least he's admitting now the dull managerialism and essentially going back to normal, which was essentially the pitch from the Starmerites of the world, which was that we've had the chaos of the Tories, but now we're going to come in, we're going to have probity in office, we're going to just fix the country by being normal and not doing the silly stuff that they did, as if that was going to be enough to save the country. The problem, of course, is that within our broader political and media establishment, no one's really reckoned with the fact that the biggest reason why we're in this mess, there are obviously plenty of reasons, right? Like inequality, institutional capture, the broader status of our economy post-1979 as being entirely beholden to international capital, which we can't convince to stick around. But as far as I'm concerned, the biggest reason for the kind of broader malaise that seems to be affecting everybody, that even if it's in an unequal society, if it had not happened the way that it did, would at least have made things slightly less bad than they are now, is the reality of the policies that took place from 2010 until 2019. It is the austerity policies of the Cameron and Osborne administration coming out of the global financial crisis, a time of a great recession, when the one thing you're supposed to do post-recession is to be able to spend money to get yourself out of the liquidity trap, and they didn't do it. And our political class treated this broadly, even the Labour Party, the sensible centrists that Andrew Marr's kind of got his wind behind, in terms of people like Ed Miliband and Ed Balls, who are part of that same kind of clique from the Labour right at this point, who willingly accepted the inconvenient truth about public spending in the wake of 2010, and this adherence to the kind of Osborneite agenda of sticking to whatever the OBR says as gospel and not moving outside of that broader bubble, has led to the broader economic stagnation that's led us to this point. In fact, it is not the supposed adults in the room that were necessary to be able to fix our country, to get the public investment, to fix all of the things that were kind of collapsing to the point where we're seeing it now across the country rather than just in the poorer areas that we did during the coalition and beyond, is because we needed to engage in more stimulus policy, which was the Corbynite manifesto. That was the whole plan in 2017, right? At the time when interest rates were still very low, the people that Andrew Marr didn't favour, like Jeremy Corbyn and especially John McDonnell, and the people who were devising policy in the background, who had the number one best policy to be able to drag our country out of a very long-term economic malaise that has continued to this day with the people, and they couldn't accept that was the case. These are the people who had the real solutions, and they still won't accept that those are the people who had the real solutions. And now the 0% interest rate era, it's gone, it's over. But that's no longer something that we have access to. And whilst there has been at least some amount of fiscal expansionary policy, some tweaking of the fiscal rules from Rachel Reeves, it is not the kind of force majeure, kind of upending of the Osborne-like kind of consensus that was built is necessary to be able to haul our country out of what's happening to everywhere in terms of the kind of faltering economy, like the kind of industrial policy that was necessary to be able to put money into the towns that have been neglected for decades in this country. If you go to Keighley, or you go to Accrington, or you go to Redcar, or you go to anywhere, indeed in Wales, for example, is far more. The scale is so great in terms of what's necessary, and Rachel Reeves is not going to do it. And fundamentally, the biggest problem is that the people, for political reasons, who in the background of the Starmer Politburo decided that, well, we can't win the election if we don't raise tax, if we promise to raise taxes. So they have straitjacketed themselves not only with these fiscal rules, not only by adhering to the OBR agenda that was created from the coalition government, they're also not giving themselves any extra room to be able to put more money in terms of taxable revenue into day-to-day expenditure because of first of all, the fiscal straitjacket, those fiscal rules, and second of all, because of the political decisions made in terms of wanting to win the election. And that's why this doom spiral will continue. There's also another element to this, which is that it turns out like the permanent political class adults in the room that Andrew Marr is claiming that they are just as kind of crooked in terms of the people that they are affiliated with as the Conservatives. This idea that somehow political corruption and having interests that are vested is only the preserve of the Conservative Party because they're a kind of hierarchical party, as was pointed out in the article, obviously very deftly there, that they're related to capital, related to the wealthy, related to like kind of hereditary wealth especially. It turns out in the wake of the kind of Blairite consensus where they kind of sold out the traditional trade union base of the party to changing the way in which that their conferences worked rather than being a kind of a meeting of the broader Labour mass movement from Blairism and onwards outside of the Corbyn interregnum. It was a time in which that they were trying to court to the interests of big business and big donors. And it's broadly this subsuming of the economy in the wake of what failed from the financial crisis into the pockets of big business, who are the only people who survived, that's led to our communities having very little wealth, having very little of their own actual kind of community wealth, especially outside of maybe Preston, who seem to have some success there. And this is why across the country, outside of like, especially urban centres, nothing seems to work at all. There's a real kind of omni crisis at the moment, which it will take far more than just looking sensible and being managerial to be able to solve. It's glad he's recognised this now, but it shouldn't take until a year into a Labour government that's failed and it's basically on its own metrics for him to be able to see that. And if he'd seen this maybe a lot earlier, we'd be in a different position altogether.
Now, I've said I didn't want this to be a pile on Andrew Marr because everyone makes false predictions, but I did find it impossible to plan a section on Andrew Marr making a very bad call without showing you this. It's a reminder of what Andrew Marr said after the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003.
Well, for the view in Downing Street on today's events, let's talk to our political editor, Andrew Marr. Andy, is it safe to assume that Mr. Blair, like so many of the rest of us, was glued to his television for parts of today?
It certainly is. He and his advisors have been watching this, and all the usual caveats apply. There could be some ghastly scenes in the future. There could be terrorist attacks. All sorts of things could go wrong. But frankly, Hugh, the main mood is unbridled relief. I've been watching ministers wander around with smiles like split watermelons.
Well, Mr. Blair's had his share of troubles and worries, as you rightly say, over the past few weeks. We've talked about them many times.
Yes.
To what extent has that changed now today?
Well, I think this does one thing. It draws a line under what had been before this war a period of when a faint air of pointlessness almost was hanging over Downing Street. There was all these slightly tawdry arguments and scandals. That is now history. Mr. Blair is well aware that all his critics out there in the party and beyond aren't going to thank him because they're only human for being right when they've been wrong. And he knows that there might be trouble ahead, as I've said. But I think this is a very, very important moment for him. It gives him a new freedom and a new self-confidence. He confronted many critics. I don't think anybody after this is going to be able to say of Tony Blair that he's somebody who is driven by the drift of public opinion or focus groups or opinion polls. He took all of those on. He said that they would be able to take Baghdad without a bloodbath and that in the end the Iraqis would be celebrating. And on both of those points, he has been proved conclusively right, and it would be entirely ungracious, even for his critics, not to acknowledge that tonight he stands as a larger man and a stronger prime minister as a result.
It's just, I know, I mean, I've seen that so many times, but I just think it's so telling. Well, the whole job of political editor of the BBC, where your job is to hang around Westminster and basically just absorb vibes. So he's saying it's undoubtable that he stands as a bigger man. The only reason people won't say he was right all along is because they're human and couldn't possibly admit what's right in front of their eyes. Not particularly useful having someone who just wanders around Westminster comment on what's going to happen when you bring down the sovereign government of another nation.